Hello, you're watching Scotland at 7 on Wednesday, the 15th of December. I'm Hugh Stewart. Now, tonight I'm going to be joined by Down in Air with Professor John Robertson. Yes, hello, John. Can you hear me loud and clear?
I can. Hi
That's
there.
fine. Good to see you again. Thanks. And also tonight from Dumfries, we have Emma Harper, MSP. Good evening, Emma. Can you hear me okay and see?
Yep, good evening,
Aha.
Hugh, and happy to be here.
Right, great stuff. So thanks. So I'll be discussing tonight's news with you two in just a few moments, but we'll first of all begin with today's coronavirus numbers. So as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 3,797,425 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 3,019,540 have been confirmed negative. 777,885 have tested positive. There are 5,155 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test. Though not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all of those with symptoms will be tested. There are 22 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,746. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 544 were in hospital last night, 38 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. today, 4,364,802 people had received their first dose of COVID-19 vaccinations, and 3,981,180 had received a second dose. 2,254,406 have received their third dose or their booster. The latest UK daily figures show 146,791 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 sadly have died from their illness, and that's an increase of 165 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just hospitals. Now today, because it's Wednesday, we have an update from the National Records of Scotland, the NRS. As of the 12th of December 2021, 12,303 deaths have been registered in Scotland where the novel coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate. These figures published today by the National Records of Scotland. In the week from the 6th through the 12th of December, 84 deaths were registered which mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, a decrease of 7 deaths from the previous week. 17 of those were aged under 65, 16 were from 65 to 74, and there were 51 deaths in people aged 75 or over. 44 were female and 40 were male. 64 were in hospitals or living in care homes, and 9 were at home or in another non-institutional setting. The number of deaths from all causes registered in Scotland this week was 1,314, which is 174 or 15% more than the 5-year average. So just before we go on with the rest of the news, have either of you two any particular comments to make on the numbers so far? We have a big increase in the number of reported infections, up to 5,000. But so far, there doesn't seem to be any sign of Omicron coming through in the hospitalisations. Does that look right to you, Emma? Is it early days yet?
Thanks, Hugh. I think one of the things the First Minister said is that we need to be aware that we don't know a lot about Omicron yet. But in my practice, I am still a registered nurse and I'm part of the vaccination team at NHS Dumfries and Galloway. So I'm watching it really, really closely. And I think what we need to do is basically encourage as many folk as possible to get their booster vaccine, because we know how virulent and transmissible this Omicron strain is, and we need to do whatever we can to mitigate transmission. So it's about, supporting what we know already, wearing face coverings, washing your hands, keeping a distance from each other. And until we get some further information about Omicron and how severe or not it is, I think we need to make sure we just encourage people to, continue to follow the guidance.
Yes, continuing mitigations. From what we reported yesterday, it might well be another 2 weeks or so before the WHO is going to give us any clear evidence on how dangerous, how deadly the new Omicron variant is. I noticed the First Minister said yesterday, although there's anecdotal evidence from South Africa that it's maybe more benign, but on the other hand, she said there's also anecdotal evidence from Denmark to the opposite. But we really don't know, so at the moment, keep up the mitigations, be careful. Any comment on that, John, before we move on?
Yes, well, I think there's quite an important development today, which is more optimistic, and Hamza Yusuf did actually tweet it. Scotland is first now to have given the booster to more than 50% of the population. We've been ahead for some time of the other three nations. We're ahead on the first and second vaccines as well. But it's a milestone, I think, when you pass 50%. Kind of milestone the BBC generally like if it involves death or infection. But so it's good that we mention it, I think.
Well, let's get that in there, yes. So 50% of eligible adults now, over 50%, have now received the third booster dose. And that must be a very impressive record, really, compared to other countries. So we will be coming back to those topics later on. Let's first look at what Prime Minister Boris Johnson said in Prime Minister's Question Time. And that was this morning in answer to Ian Blackford. The UK government is under mounting pressure over crucial COVID support for the devolved governments, following the Prime Minister's refusal to deliver new funding and instead demand that the Scottish Government increases income tax to pay for tackling the pandemic. At Prime Minister's Questions today, SNP's Westminster leader Ian Blackford said, the Scottish Government is already delivering £100 million from its fixed budget to support businesses, but that more is needed at this critical time. In response, Boris Johnson said that there are further powers under the devolution settlement for the Scottish Government to raise money. It comes after the UK Government announced that additional financial support was coming to deal with the challenges posed by the Omicron variant. However, the Treasury later U-turned, saying that it would not be new money and would instead be an advance on the Barnett consequentials. The SNP's Westminster leader Ian Blackford said the Scottish Government is delivering £100 million from its fixed budget to support businesses, but we all know more is needed. To deal with the threat posed by the Omicron variant, instead of delivering new funding to tackle a pandemic, the Prime Minister instead shamefully demanded that the Scottish Government increase income tax to pay for the pandemic, on the very same day that the cost of living crisis gripping households surged with inflation rising to 5.1%. Now, Emma, let me ask you about this. Is this a rhetorical point, do you think, by the Prime Minister saying, yes, you've got all the powers you need, you can double income tax if you want to? Is it just sidestepping the issue there of Scotland not really having the fiscal powers to raise the money that's needed?
Yep, absolutely. He's just, again, he's probably quite happy to tax people who are working really, really hard in Scotland, but yet give tax breaks to his crony pals in Westminster. He constantly talks about, okay, you can raise your taxes or whatever, but we really are at the constraints of the current fiscal settlement. And I know that Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes raises this often. She's constantly looking at how can we do things differently, but also pushing the Treasury to change how the Scottish funding is delivered. So, Ian Blackford's absolutely right to challenge the Prime Minister on this, and all Boris Johnson's bluff and bluster, to tax hardworking people in Scotland when we every other country has dealt with the pandemic by being able to borrow money. So it's something I think that Boris Johnson just needs to be constantly challenged on.
Yes, I did hear the Prime Minister saying Scotland has got plenty of opportunity to raise money, and I thought, oh, is this a new borrowing facility that I hadn't heard of before? But no, it wasn't. John, is this a fiscal trap? Is this a deliberate idea that out of all the dozen things that a country can do, Scotland can only do one, which is put up income tax? Is that a deliberate trap for the Scottish Government?
I agree entirely with what Emma said about this. I don't think it's much of a trap, actually. It's not the kind of trap that we're likely to walk into, I would think. So I think it's more a tease I'd imagine, from him. The idea that we should raise income tax and tax the less well off to pay for the pandemic is something that Douglas Ross and the Scottish Conservatives would love, and of course Anna Sarwar would love a great deal as well. It's clearly not going to happen. You can't play with income tax levels in that way unless you have control over the whole fiscal arrangement. You've got control over everything, all the taxation. You can't play with bits of it to that extent. You can make adjustments, as we have done, to reduce taxation for the less well off and slightly increase taxation, given a more progressive settlement in Scotland. But I think it's mostly a tease.
So probably just a remark that was made off, yes, but there's certainly no serious attempt to do what Boris Johnson has already done, which is to put up national insurance, of course, in England and Scotland and the other countries to pay for healthcare. Yeah. So let's move. Sorry, not really healthcare, more to do with social care. So Emma, I'm going to move on to that now. So you have yourself today announced a record investment in Scotland's NHS. So I'm not going to go into figures in detail, Emma, but is this a bigger proportion of the Scottish budget? Are we year by year having to spend more on health spending? Let me just go through the story, just in case anyone's not up to date with what Emma has herself announced today. You have welcomed today, Emma, a record investment as outlined in the budget last week. So the Scottish Government already confirmed 18 billion for health and social care, and that includes 12.9 billion for health boards through the pandemic and to accelerate the recovery of vital services. The budget also supports the creation of the new National Care Service, the single greatest public health reform since the establishment of the NHS. And the Financial Secretary, Kate Forbes, also outlined £1.6 million for social care. That includes £846.6 million for local government, £61 million to address the tragedy of drugs deaths, £290 million investment in mental health. That includes £120 million for a mental health recovery and renewal fund, an additional funding of £559 million for NHS boards, the funding of £332 million to address waiting times and support the national treatment centres. Now, let me just pause there. There's another story on that, but let's go back to the overall numbers. Emma, is this an increase in the proportion of the budget that's going to health and social care?
Yes, my understanding is that this is the highest amount of spending on health in any budget since the Scottish Parliament was established. So it's a real challenging time right now because of the pandemic, but this money is welcome. For me, in my two areas that I covered, of Fleece and Galloway and Scottish Borders council areas, it's rural, so we're always looking at what can be done to support our rural areas, and we welcome any additional funding, especially funding to tackle the issues around drug deaths. And right now in Health Committee, I'm a member of Health Committee, we're doing a perinatal mental health inquiry, and so there's been additional funding has been made available with to support perinatal mental health, and a lot of mental health around pregnancy and maternity has been exacerbated because of COVID as well. So there's been money that's been made available to support that as well. So I welcome this additional funding. We obviously need to look at how to spend that money wisely, and I am keen to follow all that progress as part of the Health Committee work that I've been doing.
Right, so this is really an important announcement that it's the biggest ever investment really in health, and that includes the social care package, which we've referred to earlier. We're gradually planning the National Care Service to stand alongside the National Health Service. So that's at its early stages just now. The other point, John, I wanted to discuss here, let me just read out what Hamza Yousaf said on the question of getting military staff to assist. For several weeks after his initial request, Health Secretary Hamza Yousaf has announced that the number of military staff assisting with the autumn-winter vaccination programme has been increased to support the acceleration of the booster rollout. With the emergence of the Omicron variant, all those aged 18 and over will be offered the booster jab by the end of the year, with everyone aged 18 to 59 currently invited to book an appointment via the online portal or attend a drop-in clinic. An additional 100 military vaccinators are joining the existing 100 staff who are working to help with the rollout. There's also 15 nurses and 6 support staff currently assisting with the programme, and this support will remain in place until the 28th of February. The new personnel will undergo final training before delivering vaccinations from next week. Discussions are taking place to ensure they're all deployed where they are needed most, and this will be kept under continual review with staff reassigned where appropriate. So the reason I thought we'd ask you this one, John, is because is this another example of the broad shoulders of the union coming to our assistance? And if so, why did they wait a few weeks to decide to do it?
I understand entirely why Hamza Yusuf and other members of the Scottish government must be diplomatic about this and apparently grateful for this help. But it isn't. I mean, it is important to keep in perspective just how small a number this is. I mean, there are 5,000 to 6,000 vaccinators, and we have an extra 100 or so. So that's a tiny percentage. On my Twitter followers, about 6,000 people, I asked them if they had seen a soldier or had been jagged by a soldier, and out of 6,000 people, about 2 had. Most were very sceptical, and the same applied to ambulance driving. I discovered they can't do emergencies because they're not trained to. 2 of the soldiers crashed ambulances in the first few days. They get lost. And I can say this because I'm not a member of any government. I don't have to be diplomatic, but it's a publicity stunt. It's a cynical publicity stunt, probably driven by Alistair Kerr.
Well, various
Sorry,
measures.
not Alistair Kerr, the wrong Secretary of State.
Well, yeah, we know what you mean. So I suppose the main point here is that we were invited, yes, well, the First Minister already said yesterday there's a number of measures are being taken to increase the efficiency of the vaccination programme. So, Emma, the First Minister mentioned, for example, reducing the waiting time. We were told originally, sit down for 15 minutes. And now that was reduced to 5 minutes. And I suppose that if people are feeling okay, they can just go straight out. So that and various other improvements were made. So are those more important than this 100 military vaccinators?
Yeah, I think whatever we can do is really important. The reducing of the waiting time is part of the fact that we now have more evidence of people being safer in order to wait for 5 minutes. As a nurse myself, if someone is going to have an anaphylactic reaction, that usually happens within the first 5 minutes. So if it hasn't happened by then, we can let people go. We do that already with flu vaccination. So I think what we would do, one of the things that I've been notified of is evening drop-in sessions as well. So tomorrow night and Friday night, for instance, this week, NHS and Fries and Galloway have a drop-in that they're looking at opening in the next couple of days, and that way evening might serve better for people that will struggle to get a vaccine because of work commitments or other commitments during the day, for instance. So I think First Minister's also volunteering herself. We saw Jason Leach has been trained to do vaccines as well. It's not just a matter of sticking a needle in somebody's arm. There is a bit more to do with actually injecting people with a vaccine. But First Minister has called on members of the Cabinet and ministers and MSPs to volunteer if they can support additional delivery as well. And for me, I'm lucky I managed to keep my nurse registration. So I've been able to help support the vaccine programme at the beginning and some of the booster at the end of September this year as well. So yeah, whatever we can do is necessary because having the vaccine is something that we can do to help prevent people getting so sick that they end up needing in the hospital.
Yep, so clearly the vaccine and the third booster is a main plank of the anti-COVID strategy, both in Scotland and UK in general. So no doubt we'll return to that in future editions. Now let's move on to the other story we heard from the Scottish Government today, is that the Chief Statistician has released statistics showing that the Scottish economy grew by 1% in the quarter from July to September this year. Changes in the gross domestic product, that's the GDP, which is the main indicator of economic growth, over the year compared to the third quarter of 2020, the economy has grown 7.1%. So let me just go over that again. I might have confused you a bit there. So in the third quarter, 1% growth based on the quarter before that. And now when you look at the same time last year, it's grown by 7.1%. So that's where we are. So during the third quarter, if you look at that in detail, the construction sector actually got smaller by 1.5%, and production also got smaller by 3.1%, whereas the services sector grew by 2.1%. So overall an increase, but some subsectors are up and some are down. The second estimate of GDP for the third quarter of 21 will be available in the quarterly national accounts for Scotland, which will be published in February. The first estimate of GDP for the fourth quarter that we're in now will be published on the 16th of March. Which happens to be my birthday, so I wonder if that's why they chose it. Okay, so I don't know if you have any quick comments on that. I did have a look, by the way, at the actual package online with the Scottish Government, and it looks like those increases and decreases are fairly in line with what's happening in the UK. I mean, at the moment, the 1% I think is quite good, because that would be 4% over a whole year. And I think the 7.1% is, again, similar to what's happening in the UK. So any particular comment on that from either of you?
Yeah, I can make 2 points very
John.
quickly. The first point is that this seems more than likely that this is largely bounce back from the pandemic period. So I don't think it's of tremendous significance. And the other reason I think it's not of much significance is that GDP is an almost useless measure of life in a country and how change takes place. Top economists, and I'm obviously not one of those, top economists despise the use of GDP. They use other measures. You're far better measuring, a profile of developments. How many more people are employed? How many more people are going to university? What's happening to childbirth levels or to various other indicators of cultural life as well. If you can have GDP growth, and virtually all of the growth goes into the pockets of the corporations, makes no difference to the life of the general population.
I'm glad you mentioned that point, John, because the GDP, it does say, I'm quoting from the chief economist, GDP is the main indicator of economic growth. Now, as I read that out, actually, part of my brain was saying, I thought the Scottish Government was committed to other ways of measuring welfare. So I don't want to nail you in this one, Emma, but have you got any particular comment on that? Do you think, have you heard of any particular statistic we should be releasing which tells you are people actually having better lives than they were last year?
Well, I mean, it's actually really worth a point to bring up. I mean, what John's saying, because we had one of a well-being economist at one of our recent cross-party groups last year, Catherine Jenrick from the Wellbeing Alliance, and she was suggesting that we should be measuring different ways of looking at how our economy is doing. And we're really struggling, and mental health is what we talk about all the time now, and I've just mentioned it with our perinatal mental health. So I think we should be looking at well-being and how people are doing, and well-being economics, and measuring that as part of where we are, because there's been some real challenges with workforce and people needing time off, and how are we tackling the pandemic? How are people coping with it? How is that affecting people's ability to go to work and then support whatever economic growth we are trying to succeed in? So I think we could be measuring things differently, and like other countries like New Zealand they have a whole wellbeing budget. So maybe we are now in an evolution of the economy and measurement of it, that we need to be doing something a bit different.
Yes, well, there is widespread understanding that we do need to measure welfare or well-being, I think you put it, Emma, and there are indeed various ways of doing that which have been suggested around the world. But I think the phrase I read out there shows that, John, there are some economists who still think GDP is the main measure. So it depends which university department you went to, I guess.
Can just come in quickly? I mean, and agree again entirely with what Emma was saying, and she's right. There have been some recent developments, and I know that particularly economists' work as well, which is very much more sophisticated than GDP. But in the 1990s, I can remember studies which looked at, in particular, the experience of working class communities in terms of access to affordable housing, decent housing, access to higher education, and so on. And this was done in the 90s, and they calculated the best year in history, all history of the UK, was 1976.
It's all been downhill since then, since the glam rock days. Now, well, I better I'll just briefly, sorry, I'm running late, but I'll just, another part of my brain just said to me a couple of minutes ago that we read out the other day a statistic from the Scottish Government, or a target, to reduce the number of miles people travel in a car. And that's an example of a welfare, it's probably good not to sit in cars, not to sit in traffic jams, and it's also good not to spew out petrol fumes. But the target is to reduce it, but that would actually reduce GDP. So that's one of the problems. Right? If you're trying to measure welfare, your GDP might actually go down. However, we will have to come back to that later. On the
I'm sorry
subject
to
of
keep
the economy,
interrupting here, but
go ahead.
if you were to cut down on illegal drug sales and prostitution, GDP would go down.
Oh, I didn't know they were counted, John. Right? Oh, I wonder which department measures those. On the economy again, John, we're going on to Brexit now, because one of the things that you used to get in standard economics courses is that it's good to increase exports over imports for obvious reasons. Now, our next story is about Brexit checks on goods entering from Ireland. Now, the UK has delayed the introduction of imminent trade checks on goods moving from the island of Ireland to the UK, as both sides sought to take the sting out of the rancorous talks over the post-Brexit arrangements for Northern Ireland. The Brexit Minister, David Frost, signalled his acceptance that the negotiations with the EU would continue into the new year, issuing a statement saying the checks due to come into force on the 1st of January would be postponed, as he put it, as an act of good faith. Frost spoke to his European counterpart, who is Commissioner Maros Sefcovic, today, and will speak again on Friday with high expectation that the talks will be put on ice over the Christmas break. Earlier this year, it had appeared that Downing Street was willing to blow up the negotiations by unilaterally suspending the arrangements on Northern Ireland and trigger Article 16 of the deal. Under the tortuously negotiated protocol in the withdrawal agreement, Northern Ireland, in effect, stays in the EU's single market, and the customs border is drawn down the Irish Sea. But both sides have agreed that consequences on trade between the UK and Northern Ireland have been heavy. Despite frantic denials of a U-turn, it's understood that the discussions between Frost and Sefcovic have been more productive in recent weeks, with sources on both sides saying that a deal in the new year was looking more likely than not. A deal in ensuring that medicines approved in the UK can continue to be used in Northern Ireland is particularly close, although the EU may still act unilaterally before the new year to deal with the issue if the final agreement is not reached this week. As it stands, most medicines entering from the UK would still have to undergo batch testing at labs in Northern Ireland at significant expense, which would reduce supply. So there's a lot of different parts in that story. First of all, Emma, what do you think about the what you might call the asymmetric outcome? Because it's relatively easy for British exporters to sell goods to Europe, but it's relatively difficult because you might have to undergo various checks. But on the other hand, goods usually are coming in from Europe without any checks. So it's one-sided, isn't it? So Brexit seems to be good for exports, but good for imports, but bad for exports. Isn't that the wrong way around?
Yeah, I mean, it's like the whole Brexit Irish Sea, border in the Irish Sea, is something that I'm very familiar with because I represent the South Scotland, and Stranraer is my hometown, and now we've got an Irish Sea border in the North Channel between Cairnryan and Larne and Belfast, and you used the word rancorous earlier, Hugh, and you're absolutely right. That's a great descriptor of what's going on between Lord Frost and all we hear is the blame of the EU. And everybody forgets that it's the UK government that caused this Brexit shenanigans. It's often referred to as a búrach. It's this constant then delay of negotiations and problems with getting goods to be checked. And it's this now they're going to sit back on their hunkers over Christmas and New Year and then resume the talks again. And of course, Lord Frost likes to insinuate that it's the EU's fault, and instead of maybe taking a wee ounce of responsibility for the fact that this issue with the Northern Ireland Protocol, the whole issue of Brexit was caused by them in the first place. I mean, the whole issue is something that people really, really do need to be aware of. And I know people in the rest of Scotland might not realise we've got a border in the Irish Sea that we were told by Secretary of State Alistair Jack and Boris that we weren't going to have. And now we're seeing the reality of what happens when we're not part of the EU anymore.
Yes, John, I remember a couple of years ago thinking, how are they going to keep Northern Ireland in the EU and in the UK at the same time? How's that going to work?
Yes, well, I think they knew that. I think they knew everything everything that has gone wrong since Brexit, and much has gone wrong. I can't imagine for a minute that the expert advisors they have didn't know that was coming, but they felt it was a price worth paying for this imagined dream of claiming back control. I mean, with every day, the whole idea becomes more and more hollow as we have to keep on giving in to Europe. Frost described it as pragmatic goodwill. That's a bit of a misunderstanding of what goodwill is.
Well, again, that's a story that's obviously is going to run and run. Now, I've just got something's just come in, so I'm going to read out. You won't have heard this, Emma, but Kate Forbes has released a statement just a few minutes ago, actually, which has just reached me. This is following the meeting of COBRA this evening. The COBRA committee has met, and Finance Secretary Kate Forbes has written to Chancellor Sunak and urging further consequentials to deal with the sudden impact of Omicron. Now, Kate Forbes said today, whilst I recognise and appreciate the early confirmation of forthcoming consequentials, I consider it entirely inadequate given the scale of the challenge we face from Omicron. I'm concerned that the current total of £220 million does not represent additional funding, as it essentially covers two items the Scottish Government had previously been notified of, or represents an anticipated funding related to pre-Omicron levels of COVID. Indeed, not only is this funding quite clearly not additional, given 268 million of consequentials had been anticipated and largely budgeted for, but the net effect of the announcement yesterday is to reduce our ability to fund public health measures and not increase it. More fundamentally, it's not a tenable position that funding is only triggered in relation to public health decisions in England. This directly inhibits our ability to protect jobs, lives and the NHS. We recognise that any system requires rigour and cannot be without controls, but a system is required that supports the decisions of each devolved administration and is not beholden to any decisions of one part of the UK. Across the UK and Scottish Government, we have already provided support to mitigate as far as possible the health and economic harms of COVID, and we must continue to do this. And the Cabinet Secretary finished by saying, without appropriate additional funding now, we will not be able to take decisions to protect public health and the wider economy at this critical juncture when we are trying to both slow the spread of the new variant and provide the additional financial support to allow that. Okay, so Em, I'm sorry to hit you with this right now. That's literally just come in. But first of all, Kate Forbes is saying all this extra money, it isn't extra money at all. Partly it's just repackaging money that we already heard about, but in fact it's actually a reduction. So your comments on that, first of all?
Yeah, my understanding, so yesterday or the other day when Kate was making the announcement of the budget, or I think the First Minister, that Rishi Sunak was magicking some money for the Scottish Government, but it turns out it's not new money at all. So it's this constant rhetoric of, oh, we're supporting you, when it's not support at all. It's not any additional extra money. It's almost as if they want the Scottish Government to fail in public health measures. I think what we need to do is make sure that people are aware of what is being proposed, that this isn't any new money, it's just rebadged money. And the sooner that we can go alone, the better. The sooner that Scottish Government and the sooner that we have independence for our country and make all the decisions and have the full fiscal control so that we can decide what we want to do with our money. The pandemic has just totally shown that how unfair this settlement or this agreement with the UK government is for us. So I support Kate Forbes's approach. I think she's doing a fantastic job as Finance Secretary, and Kate obviously will be making the right decisions for us as we try and mitigate whatever we can with the paltry sums of money that the UK government seem to be offering.
Yeah, that's the first point then, of course. Kate Forbes doesn't really believe that the announcement yesterday really is new money at all. But the second point, John, is that the Finance Secretary is saying we cannot really make decisions about finance until somebody in another part of the UK has made a decision, and then we get the consequences of it. So that's always going to be the case under devolution, isn't it?
Yeah, well, as Emma's pointed out, again, I'm almost following on from Emma here, so I'm largely in a position of saying I agree with what she's said. And she highlighted the point about the special circumstances of a pandemic. When times are calm, when there's not a great deal happening, I think there are things to be achieved from devolution. But when there's a crisis, it brings into sharp perspective the need for complete control. If you haven't got complete control, then you can't deal with a crisis. That's the point I would make, I think.
Right, thank you, John. So we must move on now. We're looking at the clock. We're going to move on to the story today about aid for Afghanistan. And the issue is about, of course, the impending difficulties that people in that country are going to face. In fact, are facing already as we move into winter. Leading charities today have launched a joint winter appeal to save the lives of 8 million people at risk of starvation in Afghanistan, as aid workers in that country warn of a small window of opportunity to intervene. A combination of conflict, economic collapse, drought, and the COVID-19 pandemic has brought that country to a tipping point, according to the Disasters Emergency Committee, the DEC. That's the umbrella group of 15 agencies behind this appeal. Fiona McShea, Director of Humanitarian Operations for Save the Children UK, said, "There's a very small window of opportunity for us to support the population of Afghanistan. The situation is very bad at the moment. Winter is coming quickly now. I've witnessed emergencies around the world, and I can honestly say this is the worst situation I have seen." The launch of the appeal comes today as the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, predicted that the near universal poverty will take hold in Afghanistan next year, with 97% of the population at risk of living below the poverty line. Afghanistan has topped the IRC's list of countries most at risk of a deteriorating humanitarian crisis in 22, with Ethiopia and Yemen ranked second or third. What on earth can you do about that, John? 97% of the population in poverty line, and winter coming in. That's dreadful, yes, isn't it? What on earth can we do?
8 million at threat of famine, and it won't be a kind of even distribution. It will be primarily women and children who will suffer. We know that from all other famines, that women and children suffer more than the rest of the population. When you've been intervening, as the West has for about nearly 200 years in a country, a troubled country admittedly, but perhaps more troubled because of our intervention, when you pull out, your responsibility is not ended. If you make a mess, you need to tidy up. We have an overwhelming responsibility to do something about the suffering in Afghanistan, regardless of our kind of petty disputes between our leadership and their leadership. I don't have any time for the Taliban. Why would I? Taliban would have me hung by a lamppost within minutes. But you can't let that get in the way of humanity, and we need to do something.
Well, that's the story tonight. Near universal poverty, as the IRC puts it, in Afghanistan. We have to move on now, John. The next story. Derek Chauvin pleads guilty to civil rights charges in the killing of George Floyd. Now, the former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin has admitted to violating George Floyd's civil rights during the arrest which killed Mr. Floyd in May 2020, sparking mass racial justice protests across the United States and beyond. Chauvin appeared in federal court in person this morning to change his plea to guilty. He is charged with 2 counts of depriving Mr. Floyd of his rights, for pinning his knee against Mr. Floyd's neck as the black man said he couldn't breathe, and for failing to provide medical care to Mr. Floyd during a 25th of May 2020 arrest, which resulted in Mr. Floyd's death. Chauvin, who is white, has already been convicted of state murder and manslaughter charges and is serving a sentence of 22.5 years. He also faces 2 more counts in a separate case involving the restraint of a black teenager in 2017. Mr. Floyd's arrest and death, which a bystander captured on cell phone video, sparked mass protests nationwide that called for an end to the racial inequality and police mistreatment of black people. Chauvin and 3 other former officers, Kane, Quing and Tao, were indicted earlier this year on federal charges alleging they willfully violated Mr. Floyd's rights. A federal trial for the other 3 men still appears to be scheduled for January. So, Emma, the point here is, as far as I can understand, the legal point is about the Constitution. Every American citizen, of course, has several rights protected in the Constitution, and we hear a lot from the Republicans in America. They're defending the Constitution, but do these people not see that the Constitution goes for everybody, black people as well?
Absolutely. Just looking at Derek Chauvin's history, he had years of issues back till 2014, I think, where he has been quite, I guess, abusive to people and violating their human rights. It reminds me of when I lived in Los Angeles during the Rodney King issue, where LAPD police officers battered and assaulted Rodney King, and he was a black man. They left him brain damaged, and and those policemen got off with it. So they totally violated Rodney King's rights as well. So it's not just Derek Chauvin he's not the only police officer that seems to be treating people who are not white in this way, and it's happening across America. I hope George Floyd is the last person to be killed by a policeman, but I'm sure he won't be. But I know that we need to make sure that we keep this issue alive and that we deal with it. We need to protect human beings' lives at all costs. And, when our police officers are supposed to protect and serve, they should be protecting and supporting people and be extremely aware of what the power that they have over people. So I think we need to continue to follow this issue and do whatever we can to support people of ethnic minorities, that this kind of human rights assault doesn't happen to other people.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. So this is federal prosecutors reminding Americans really that the Constitution is for everybody. Just to underline that, if he's found guilty of a violation of Mr. George's rights under the Constitution, Chauvin could end up having an extra 2 years in jail, as 2 sentences would run concurrently. That's if he's found guilty of that offence. Now I'm going to move on, John. Ensuring a fair journey to net zero. Another story we have today is that the full membership of the Just Transition Commission has been announced. This will be a 12 parliamentary term commissioners who will be working alongside the commission chair, who is Professor Jim Skia, and he will scrutinise. They will all scrutinise, advise and report annually on the progress Scotland is making to ensure a greener, fairer future for everyone. 4 further fixed-term commissioners have been appointed to provide expert industry advice and insight on the Just Transition Plan for the energy sector and work to co-design that plan, set to start next year. Additional commissioners providing specialist experience and insight will be appointed for the duration of each sectoral Just Transition plan. The Minister for Just Transition, Richard Lochhead, said, "Ensuring our journey to net zero is just and fair for everyone is critical, and the appointment of the Just Transition Commission membership marks an important step in this progress." So, John, I've had a quick look today at who is on the commission, and as the Minister said, there's a mixture of people from industry, experts. I also noticed there's trade union representatives on it. I wonder, do you think that's important that all sectors of society are listened to and are able to put their input into what exactly do we mean by the just transition?
Well, obviously, it's good for there to be a breadth of opinion. I mean, nobody could question that. I think there's something maybe being missed here, and that's the just transition mustn't be, to my mind, a kind of lumber for the state that the state must subsidise. The energy companies now, the privatised energy companies, are rich beyond belief. They have billions invested overseas, and they're already starting to invest in transition themselves. They're starting to buy up renewable companies. They're starting to try to find alternatives for oil rigs and so on. The major energy companies must pay for this transition. They have the money. It's not being used for anything else. It's just lying offshore in bank accounts. So I think clearly there's a role for government in guiding this process, but not for paying for it all, as the corporations would have us do if we let them off with it.
Yeah, a good point. In fact, on that subject, John, I noticed today that Royal Dutch Shell is actually buying an American solar generator. So they're talking about moving beyond oil. So yes, that certainly is a trend that will be happening. If there's money to be made in the green technology, I'm sure they'll be there making it. So I must move on. Emma, maybe you could discuss this one with me, supporting Scotland's rural economy. The Scottish budget also underlined the Scottish Government's commitment to rural and island communities and businesses. The 22 to 23 budget will see more than 650 million in ongoing support across the rural economy in agriculture, fishing and seafood. It forms a part of an overall budget which strengthens the resilience of rural, coastal and island communities, businesses and industries to recover from the pandemic and from the EU exit. The funding also supports the critical transformation of agriculture and marine economies to meet the 2045 emissions reduction targets and reinforces action to reverse biodiversity loss, restore nature and protect our future. The move to transform how farming and food production is supported to make Scotland a global leader in sustainable and regenerative agriculture will see £25 million of investment. Food industry support of £10.5 million provides vital assistance to Scotland's food and drink sector, underpinning its recovery from both COVID-19 and from the EU exit. A new round of agri-environment investment will be delivered as part of the overall £36 million budget, including funding to help deliver the commitment to double the land used for organic farming. Marine Scotland Directorate, which is responsible for the integrated management of Scotland's seas, will see funding rise by almost £10 million, underlining the Scottish Government's commitment towards net zero and biodiversity through the expansion of offshore renewables, climate-related research and environmental protection. The successful Marine Fund Scotland, which has supported a range of marine-related businesses, will see funding maintained at £14.5 million. Rural Affairs Secretary Mary Gudgeon said, "Rural and coastal communities have been hit hard by the economic impacts of Brexit and the pandemic. This budget underlines our commitment to supporting these communities, sustaining and creating employment while meeting our climate change responsibilities." So Emma, there's quite a lot in this message actually. We're talking about regenerating the land and also the sea, the fisheries. So there's more to climate change than simply reducing a mileage or moving to a different type of fuel. It's also about looking after nature. Do you see that as an important part of the new Scotland?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You've just outlined like a massive amount of funding for different applications actually, and in a lot of my work, because I represent a South Scotland region, it's very rural. So for the last 5 years before this parliamentary session, I was really focused on what we can do to support our our farmers and agriculture as well. And we know that farmers are blamed for emissions and high emissions, but our farmers in Scotland are producing some of the best world class and welfare supported beef and sheep, for instance. So we need to support that, and we need to do whatever we can to support them to make sure their farming is regenerative and sustainable. So there's a lot of work that is being taken forward. I think Marie Goujon is doing a great job. She's working well with our National Farmers Union, and we've had lots of good feedback from our National Sheep Association as well. So there's a lot out there for me, because we've got the whole of the Solway Firth and the southwest coast as well. There's the whole marine investment to support the biodiversity in our marine environment is really important as well. So I'm going to continue to raise the issues around what we can do to support short supply chains, supporting our local producers, get people engaged with buying our produce from our own farmers in our own country. So it's there's a lot of good to be said about what is being invested in for our agricultural and marine sector right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that strikes me reading this report is the putting together the two phrases, the Brexit problem and the COVID problem. Now, everybody knows that COVID is a crisis, but John, we don't usually in the media describe Brexit as a crisis. In fact, I think we should stop calling it Brexit. From now on, I think we should start calling it the Brexit Buruk. But does the media, in your opinion, does the media talk about Brexit as an opportunity or as a crisis?
I think they tend to ignore many of the negative consequences. I think that's particularly true of the state media, where there's I think a fear of the UK government. The UK government may take away the licence or disband them in some way, privatise them. There are certainly those within the Conservative Party that would love to get rid of the BBC. In Scotland, the situation is different, and it's not so much. Brexit is largely ignored. Other explanations are often offered for problems with the economy. What's more distinctive in the Scottish media is the coverage of the pandemic and the tendency to foreground and to platform people who merely own pubs or clubs or bars or something like that, as if they were epidemiologists or virologists. I'm not sure which would be appropriate. And as is my practice, and it was my career, I look at media coverage elsewhere. And when you look at media coverage in Scotland, you see hospitality reps up front heading the story and kind of casting doubt on the work of experts in the Scottish government and their advisors. You only have to look at Wales, England, and Northern Ireland BBC, and you don't find those stories at all. Look at Ireland, you don't find them. I did a study, and I had a look at Belgium and Germany. These stories come up. The major newspapers in these countries and the state broadcaster, they set out to educate the population, inform them, and help them understand what's happening. In Scotland, they try to undermine the strategy.
Now, on that topic, we actually put out a tweet this morning, and we have quite a large response from Broadcasting Scotland on Twitter. We seem to have touched on a matter of real concern for the responses of that tweet relating to the way public health messages in Scotland seem to have been politicised and confused by some in the Scottish media. A tweet was in response to listening to Kay Adams' morning programme on BBC Radio Scotland. Why do BBC Scotland, in particular Kay Adams, seem determined to undermine and confuse the Scottish Government's public health message instead of acting like a responsible public service broadcaster and reinforce the message? So, Emma, how should the media be actually reporting the public health crisis?
Well, they should be accurate for a start, and they should be using evidence. I mean, we've got already issues in the south of Scotland because we don't get STV in Dumfries and Stranraer or over in Hoyk, for instance. We have to deal with our public health messaging coming from ITV Border, which means that sometimes the messaging might be confusing for people. And I have a real problem with that, because I want our messaging, well, I'm an evidence-based nurse practitioner, and so I want to make sure that whatever we do is we tell people what's the evidence and how to basically deal with that, and here's what the advice is. And I think the opposition like to muddy the waters with messaging just so that people get angry, and what we need to do is protect people and save lives.
So, John, on the subject of the Kay Adams programme particularly, people I've been reading, I wasn't actually listening to it this morning, but there seems to be a heavy loading on the people they have calling in, or the people tweeting in, seem to be mainly, as you said, people who work in the hospitality sector. So do you think is that just because all those people are angry and they're phoning in, or is it because they're deliberately selected by the programme producers?
It would be an interesting process to be a fly on the wall observing the editorial process there. It's a very subjective process. They make choices. They make choices all the time. Make choices on what stories to report, how to report them. And when it comes to vox pops, people phoning in, they weed. And they sometimes weed them because they think they'll be more entertaining. But there's a clear pattern, especially on the Kay Adams show, also on Good Morning Scotland and on Reporting Scotland, to somehow always find voices critical of Scottish Government policy or action. I think it's just too much of a pattern to be other than something we should be concerned about. I like to say I'm not paranoid. People claim they're not paranoid, and you think you maybe mistrust them. And then largely I think it's a culture, it's a lazy culture operating. Although at senior levels it's clearly a bit more planned than that. And Emma mentioned the opposition parties. The opposition parties have very good connections with, in particular, with BBC, but also with the Herald and the Scotsman, and they feed this negativity. The opposition parties in Wales and England and Northern Ireland don't. Public health is an area in which they recognise that we need to pull together to solve this problem. But in Scotland, the opposition parties, with their friends in the media, are quite happy to risk lives to get their way, they think.
Yes, I heard on the radio last night, I heard the first story on the BBC radio in Scotland about the First Minister's statement in the Parliament yesterday was to say, and now we look at the fallout from the First Minister's statement. Yeah, I'm sure you wouldn't expect anyone in Wales to be talking about the fallout from an announcement of Mark Drayford. So the language is, yeah, maybe it's part of the culture there. But anyway, we must move on. Sorry, I'm sure there's a lot more you would both like to say on these, but we've just about run out of time. A lot of news tonight. So thank you for John Robertson for joining us tonight, and to Emma Harper. And have you anything else just before I go home for my tea, John?
Sorry, I mean, I've always got something to say, so you should really just keep me on a tight rein. You mentioned Mark Drayford there, and I was interested in make a comparison today with the Herald. Had a story about Sturgeon being accused of harming the hospitality industry. At the same time in Wales, Mark Drakeford was accusing members of the public of not getting vaccinated. So, it's an interesting contrast.
Right, well, thanks for bringing that to me. I don't have the opportunity to look at the media, to survey the overall coverage of the media, so it's very interesting to have you on and to make those points, John. So thanks for joining us again tonight. That was very, very interesting. And Emma Harper, it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you very much for coming on Scotland at 7 tonight. So that just leaves for me to thank everybody for watching. If you're one of our subscribers, it's great to have you on board, and if you're not, it would be really worthwhile considering putting a bit of money in to so we can increase the range of programmes we're able to cover on Broadcasting Scotland. So there's the site on screen there if you'd like to become one of our subscribers. All the money we get in will be used in extending our programme making. So that's it for Scotland at 7 tonight, and so thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.